Hi everybody. Today we're going to be looking at the law of demand. This is from Area of Study 2 in Unit 1. It's decision making in markets. So we're going to be talking about the law of demand, and as you'll see, there's a number of aspects to it that we'll be following and relating to a particular topic. Essentially, we actually would know what the law of demand is. It states that with everything else being equal, as the price of a good or service increases, the consumer demand for that good or service would decrease, and the reverse is the truth. So essentially, what that says is if something gets more expensive, we're less likely to want to purchase that product. And that's a pretty standard rule, and you guys have probably found that that's essentially how you've been operating as well. When something's more expensive, we're far less likely to purchase the product. So obviously, if a price increases, what we find is there will be a contraction in the quantity demanded, and that causes a movement upwards along the demand line. You can see it in our diagram here, that because price has gone up, the quantity demanded is actually reduced or contracted, and as a result of that, the arrow, as you can see, is pointing to the left because demand is actually falling as a result of too much, or the price going up too much. Likewise, if the price goes down, what actually happens is demand increases. In this case, it's an expansion of demand, and more would be demanded as the prices become cheaper. So we actually talk about movements along the demand line. They're known as expansions and contractions, but the thing is they are only caused by changes in price. And as I've said before, maybe the best way of thinking about this is that expansion and contraction that starts with E and C, and you'll notice that the last two letters of price are C and E, so it's an easy way to remember. If the change is because of the price, the demand line is going to will have an expansion or a contraction along the demand line simply because price has changed. There are several factors that will actually affect demand. We'll have a look at them at the moment. The first of them is what we'd call a rise in disposable income. So once we've paid for everything we have to pay for, like our living expenses, rent and mortgages, etc., what we normally have left over is what's known as our disposable income. And we call it disposable because it means it's the income that we could actually go out and spend or dispose of. And obviously, if we have a higher amount of disposable income, it tends to mean that we'll probably buy more of a product at a given price simply because we have more money to afford that product. The reverse is true. If we have a fall in disposable income, what that would mean is it probably will reduce the amount that we would be willing to purchase at a particular price given we have less income now. If the population size grows, generally seems that most goods or services there'll be a greater quantity demanded simply because there's more people wanting those particular products. So if immigration rates increase, if there is a higher birth rate, we'll actually tend to have a higher or an increase in demand as a result of that. Likewise, if the population declines, if there's less people here than there were previously, we might find that there's a reduction in demand for some goods or services simply because the population has reduced. Some items, as you guys would be familiar with, are more trendy, more fashionable. Over time, as a result of that, demand for those products tends to increase, particularly with advertising and also with new technology, and Apple are a fantastic example of that. Some products also become less fashionable over time. So something like a DVD player, their prices would fall. The demand for those products becomes very less. Even with the declining price, people are still not that interested in those products anymore. Interest rates are very important in economics, and if interest rates actually decrease, what that means is that it's cheaper for people to borrow money. So if it's cheaper for people to borrow money, what tends to happen is demand increases because people have actually got access to funds that they can use to purchase goods and services. So if interest rates fall, that becomes a pretty good incentive for people to borrow money and therefore purchase more products. Works the other way. If interest rates go up, what we generally find is that people will be less likely to want to spend and demand will fall for particular products, given the fact that it's becoming more expensive to afford them. And we also need to talk about complementary goods. These are goods and services that we buy and use them at the same time as another item. The most obvious example would be a car. If we buy a car, it's not going to be much use to us unless we put some fuel in it. So if the price of one complement falls, the demand for the other complementary good is likely to rise. So a good example would be if petrol prices actually fell, and they're falling quite a bit at the moment, we've just got nowhere to go. But if petrol prices fall, the demand for larger vehicles will actually increase simply because they become a more viable alternative. And likewise, if a complementary good or service increases in price, what we might find is there'd be a decrease in demand for that product. For example, if the price of coffee were to rise and the demand for sugar decreases at a given price. Substitutes are a particular good or service that can be easily replaced by another. In economics, we always talk about butter and margarine. And the price of one will affect the demand for the other. So for example, when the price of margarine goes up, the demand for butter is likely to increase simply because it's seen as an alternative or a substitute product. Likewise, if the substitute product does become cheaper, then the demand for the alternative product at any price will actually decrease because people will switch between the products. So butter and margarine is always a good example of that. When consumer confidence is up, people tend to feel confident about making big purchasing decisions, and as a result, demand would tend to increase. So luxury cars, holidays, houses, they would tend to be more in demand as people's confidence about the future increases. The same with businesses who might go out and employ more people or build a new factory, etc. Likewise, if consumer or business confidence is low, then demand for certain products tends to fall. So something like white goods, appliances, etc., they might not be as in demand simply because people are worried about making big purchases like that when they're not too sure about their future. We also need to think about what the seasons of the year. For example, in summer, the demand for some products at any price will go up. So things like ice cream, surfboards, air conditioners, that's quite obvious. But it also might mean that in winter, we'll see a decrease in the demand for those products which we actually were wanting in summer, something like air conditioners. So we need to think about the season and the demand for those particular products. And obviously at the moment, with the coronavirus situation in Australia and around the world, the demand for things like face masks and antiseptic hand wipes, etc., is quite high. Once the virus passes, you'd assume those demand levels would go back to normal. The government can also impact demand as well. If the government puts more money into transport spending, it might bring about an increase in the demand for building and road making materials. And the government might use cash to encourage people to buy certain items such as solar panels and rainwater tanks, and as a result, those government policies will increase demand. In addition, some government policies are designed to reduce demand, and the most obvious one is taxes on things like cigarettes, but also laws making it illegal for young people to purchase alcohol and as a result reduce demand. So let's have a look at the slides and just see how it would actually work in reality. We've got demand graphs on this chart or on this slide. And the first one is talking about non-price conditions, which can increase the quantity demanded at a given price. And what happens when we have demand conditions which are not price related? they actually end up being what we call a shift in demand. And the entire demand curve in this situation has actually shifted to the right. It's gone from demand line 1 to demand line 2. And what that actually is showing us is that there's been an increase in the amount that people want at a given price. And as a result of that, the whole demand line is actually shifted to the right, because by shifting to the right, you can see that we're actually increasing the quantity demanded. In this case, the quantity demanded has gone from 10 units to 15 units, simply because of these non-price conditions. On the other side of the slide, we can see non-price conditions decreasing the quantity demanded. So in this situation, some of the factors we've talked about in this particular set of slides have actually caused the demand line to shift to the left. And by shifting to the left, we're actually reducing the quantity demanded, in this case going from 10 units down to 5 units. So guys, taking a look at demand and the different factors for it, go back over those slides. If there's anything you want me to go over with, any questions you guys have, just let me know. Thanks very much, and we'll talk more about demand very soon.